Hi, it's Laura at Aquamarine18. Thanks for stopping by my channel today. I am here with a bit of a chatty update, I suppose, and what I envision to be the first in a probably pretty short series of videos wrapping up my depth year 2020, which I've had a playlist about and updated periodically throughout the year. I'm planning over the course of December to make a video about my reading this year, so kind of book highlights. I'm not going to go over every book or anything ridiculous like that, but some favorite authors I found and would like to share things like that, as well as a video on decks that have joined my collection this year while I was kind of not purchasing too much and thinking about mindful purchasing, things like this. But this one is kind of a general discussion, I guess. And I am inspired here to make this video by a comment which was left for me on my last depth year video, which was a kind of 3/4 point update. And the comment was left for me by Sarah of Waterchild Tarot, and she wrote, part of what she wrote was, "One facet of the discussion that seems to be missed in a lot of depth year videos and something I'd love to see in your year wrap-up is how the depth year has helped you develop. Did you gain new skills in your crafts, make something you wouldn't have otherwise, read a book that changed your thinking on a topic, learn something about yourself or the tarot by studying from a different perspective? In other words, how have depth year goals helped you to go deep?" And so, thank you, Sarah, for that comment. In thinking about this, I have tried to pinpoint a couple of areas that I have ended up going deep with in my depth year, and kind of things that I've learned that I feel like kind of answer this question and also maybe don't easily fit into the other depth year conclusion videos that I've planned. So this is really just some things that I've maybe gotten the most out of my depth year, or that I've learned, I guess, or discovered or rediscovered, whatever the case may be, that I think speaks to this question. And the framing of this question was in part, thinking about where in the depth year I have gone deep or engaged with in a new way or in a particular way because of the depth year, as opposed to updates on things like low buy and purchasing and things like that, right? So I hope this answers that question and is somewhat of an interesting ramble anyway. This felt like a good video to make for me today. I will be honest, I have been low capacity these last couple of weeks with the semester ending. It is busy, my goodness. But I do have these 3 things that I've gotten out of my depth year, that I've learned, and that I am, I guess, grateful for the depth year concept or grateful for the depth year goals that I set, because I've learned these things. And so the first one is related to my book stack of shame, which I've shared before, and that was a goal at the start of the year to read the books that I already owned, and there were 10 of them. Read the books that I already owned but hadn't read yet before buying more books. And there are videos earlier on in my depth year playlist about this, my progress and reading those books and what those books were. There was a bit of a range, some nonfiction, nonfiction for the most part, actually, I think, and just an assortment there. And this goal has maybe been the one of all of the depth year goals that I set for myself that I feel like has given me the most. I feel like I have rediscovered the joy of reading for pleasure because of Book Stack of Shame and because of Depth Year 2020. I will talk more about all of the books again that I've read in a dedicated video about that, but I feel like for the last couple of years I haven't been reading as much, as I once did. I was in university and then grad school from 2005 to 2016. And so I was reading a ton for work. And I still read a ton for work. But, over the course of that time, doing a lot of dense reading and reading really in detail and very particular, subjects for my dissertation and things like this, along the way, I lost my passion for fiction in particular. And I stopped reading things that weren't either things that I was reading for something, like for a project, or things that I was assigned. And, I've been reading very narrowly. In grad school, you get kind of narrower and narrower and narrower in your focus as you go. So through this book stack of shame and reading this pile of books that, all of them for different reasons, at one time or another, I had bought because I was interested in them, that I wanted to read, that, were books that I had picked just based on interest, but hadn't made the time for. Reading those 10 has totally kickstarted my reading again. I had kind of set a goal on Goodreads. You can set a goal for how many books you want to read in a year. And at the start of 2020, or maybe at the end of 2019, I don't remember, I set my Goodreads goal at an ambitious 36 books, thinking, that's 3 a month as what I would read in 2020. And I'm very rapidly approaching 100 books now. So, I don't think that reading or like the quality or value of reading comes from numbers at all. But this is all to say that, I used to read really prolifically like this, just for my own enjoyment, and I lost it. And as much as I've laughed about it over the year, the book stack of shame has given me that back. And, in the process, my partner has experienced a reignition of a love of reading as well. And that's something that we can share, share together and share books together. And that's a really wonderful thing, as well. And reading this breadth of books as well in the book stack of shame has, meant that I've read a lot more widely this year than I have in prior years as well. I will share in a book update video for my depth year a full list and a description box of all the books that I've read this year. But there's quite the range. There's a lot of fiction. Sci-fi and fantasy are the genres that I love. Sci-fi in particular, fantasy I'm getting into now. But I've read autobiography, I've read nature writing, I've read short stories and novellas and novels and all kinds of things. And I feel like it is because of the depth here book stack of shame that I have found this again. And now I'm reading just for my own enjoyment every night. Even now when I'm in the process of grading like 150 term papers, that love has been reignited in such a way that I'm still reading in bed every single night. And I am really, really happy that this has happened. And my, books to read list on Goodreads is full of things that I had never heard about, books that aren't even out yet. This is really just jump-started something for me in terms of reading. So that is like, it sounds like super cheesy, but it's a life changer. I've discovered favorite authors this year that I feel like if I didn't approach this in the way that I did, I would never have found. And I'll talk more about those later. But so that's the first big kind of depth year thing was just loving reading. The second was in relation to another depth year goal, that this is probably the only place I'm going to talk about the depth year goal that I had, which was to study Lenormand. And so I have 2 books on Lenormand and a very, very small collection of Lenormand decks, like 4 or 5, I think. And I only bought 1 Lenormand deck this year, actually. But I've studied Lenormand, and, this was my plan. I had studied Marseille, and Pip decks in 2019 and 2020. One of the depth year goals was to really engage with and study Lenormand. And what I have learned in studying Lenormand is that Lenormand will never be my go-to system. I thought for a quick minute that it might be something that I got really, really into. I have encountered some roadblocks along the way, but I just don't think that Lenormand is for me. And I think that that's okay. I feel like a lot of the time from what I've seen of depthier videos and depthier updates and conversations, that not going as deeply into something as one hoped to at the start of the year is so often framed as a failure, right? Like, I really wanted to study this thing in depth and I just never got around to it, or I really wanted to study this thing and something else took my attention instead, or I didn't stick with that goal. But in this case, I stuck with it enough to know that I had stuck with it enough. And I think that counts for something. I don't think that that's a failure. I'm glad that I have studied Lenormand in the ways that I have. I do think that some of the skills in terms of reading Lenormand that I've picked up from books and things like this are transferable skills to other cartomancy systems and card-based divination systems. So I in no way feel like any of that time was a waste. I love the very, very tiny handful of Lenormand decks that I have, which are Kelly Fitzgerald's Story in Color Lenormand, the Memento Mori Oracle by Claire of Black and the Moon that has a Lenormand in it, the Green Glyphs Lenormand, and this year I did back on Kickstarter and it's incredible, the Black Gold Lenormand, Grandma Baby's Black Gold Lenormand. And I love all of these decks, and I'm going to continue to explore these decks, but I don't think in-depth Lenormand study is going to be something that is for me. And so while I'm going to be, continuing to explore and work with those decks and probably will eventually, read more of the Lenormand books that I have, I learned in my depth exploration that was enough for me to learn the basics, and I learned Lenormand card meanings, and I got to reading cards in pairs and small groups and things like this. I never did get to the grand tableau, but I have learned that, I probably will never get to the grand tableau, and I feel fine with that. That is not any judgment on people who love Lenormand or for whom Lenormand is the go-to system, or who read grand tableaus every day or anything. It's not that I think that it's a bad system or anything like that. I've just come to realize that it is not going to be a major part of my practice, and I kind of and I think that it's part of the depth here that is what has allowed me to figure this out, because it was through the depth here goal that I actually dedicated enough time to making notes and having a dedicated notebook and highlighting and underlining in my Lenormand books and cross-referencing and making my own tables of meanings for the cards, synthesizing meanings from a bunch of different sources, like the way that I would study a new system that I've learned a lot from, but has also gotten me to the point of saying, like, that's good, I'm good, I'm happy with that. So yeah, Lenormand is not my thing. But I will say, I'm going to keep exploring the decks that I have, and I'm also going to keep talking about and supporting, in particular, creators who are working to make Lenormand a more inclusive and welcoming system. I have a video on my channel about making Lenormand as a system more 2S LGBTQ plus accessible and inclusive. You can watch that video if you like. I won't get into all those points again, but needless to say, it speaks to some of the barriers I had trying to get into Lenormand. And I think that, the creators and authors doing the work of breaking down those barriers is really awesome and worth supporting. So even if Lenormand is not, going to be my new home in terms of a divination system, I will continue to support that work 100%. So that's the first two, love of reading and not as much love as I expected of Lenormand. And the third depth point, I guess, that's again another one that I don't know quite where I would put it in terms of other depth year updates, so it makes sense to talk about it here, is that I have somewhat unexpectedly, because it wasn't a depth year goal, I have ended up taking a deep dive into the reclaiming tradition of witchcraft. And this was not, again, a depth year goal, but the way that this kind of came about was that on my book stack of shame, I was going to say, you may recall, nobody's going to recall that. On my book stack of shame, I had this book that I had bought called Elements of Magic, Reclaiming Earth, Air, Fire, Water, Spirit, and it's an edited collection, edited by Jane Meredith and G'day Parma, with a foreword by Starhawk. And this is a book that's based on the Elements class, which is kind of the most introductory of the core classes in the reclaiming tradition. So I had this book on my stack. I still have not read it, but I gave myself a check mark on the stack of shame anyway. And the reason was that I found out that Elements of Magic, the course that this is kind of based on in reclaiming, that Elements has a prerequisite reading, and the prerequisite reading for it is a good portion of the Spiral Dance, Rebirth of the Ancient Religion of the Great Goddess by Starhawk. And this book I have read. And so at the start of the year when I figured this out, it was like, okay, I'm not going to read the Elements book without going to the prerequisite first. I'm a fan of doing the prerequisite first. And then I ended up in a Discord server with some other folks, hosted by Kara of Cute Witch 772 here on YouTube. And so we ended up reading the Spiral Dance together over the course of the entire year. So we broke it down into a couple of chapters a month, or sometimes a single chapter a month, and we discussed ultra in depth into this book in ways that, like, I never would have, again, if it wasn't for kind of the Elements book indirectly getting me here. And you know, we went so in depth reading for this book. You know, if reading a 10-page chapter is going to take me a month, I have notes. And I have notes on notes. I have notes on the footnotes. I have notes on the updates, because this is a 20th anniversary edition, so there's 10th and 20th anniversary notes in there. I think they're about due for like a 40th or something like that now. Anyway, I've spent a ton of time on Spiral Dance, so that is something that I've somewhat unexpectedly gone in depth with, you know, and as a basis for diving into the reclaiming tradition of witchcraft. And now I've also bought, sitting on my book stack to read, which is no longer a book stack of shame. Now it's a book stack of loving enthusiasm. I bought the little Pagan Portals Reclaiming Witchcraft book by Iris Anya Moon. And this one is not like the others. It's not a kind of, you know, book of rituals or things like that, or magic how-tos, which I think the others are a bit more, exercises and things like this. This one is much more about the structure of the reclaiming tradition in terms of the ways in which it is institutionalized, like the core classes and the history and how the decision-making structures work, and the principles of unity, and how local communities are like federated, for lack of a better word. It's not really federated, but how local communities are kind of connected into a larger tradition, and things like this. And I'm looking forward to reading this. I'm going to talk more, you know, with reference to the Spiral Dance in another video as well, probably in the new year, if I'm honest with myself, because I did have a great question from a commenter on my channel about the ontological and epistemological kind of underpinnings of my spiritual or religious practice, and you know how that relates to my feminism, or my kind of academic or intellectual or political life. And so I'm going to talk about feminist spirituality and what that means to me, and the relationship for me between spirituality and social justice in another context. But those are the kinds of questions that I've been getting really deeply into exploring this year. with a group of other folks in this conversation about spiral dance who have, different relationships to the reclaiming tradition than I do, definitely different kind of degrees of experience represented. There are some reclaiming teachers in there. There are other folks who identify with the tradition, have done classes, some who haven't done classes. Then there's me, who's kind of reclaiming curious, reclaiming adjacent, So that's been really good and has given me a lot of questions. And I don't know that I have any neat kind of conclusions about this, like what I've learned so much, because it's ongoing, very much so. But in the context of talking about spiral dance and learning about reclaiming and exploring this, now decades-old book about feminist spirituality, really, I've been really digging into my feelings about and relationship with the idea of religious or spiritual traditions, what it means to be part of a tradition, how I feel about locating myself in that way, that I think I have had a lot of baggage about and hesitancy around, particularly having been raised in a Catholic context, which is a very, as far as traditions go, is, hyper-centralized, right? There's a world head of the religion with an official interpretations for everything. And then trying to explore something like reclaiming that is incredibly decentralized, that, there are points of unity, but so much difference. And what does that mean? And what does that mean for it to be a tradition? And what can be my relationship to that? And kind of exploring my relationship to witchcraft prompted, all the way back at 31 Days of Witchcraft by Heather Carter, which has kind of sent me on all of these depth explorations in some ways as well. And really just finding spiritual or religious community in a place, i.e. online, Discord, that I never kind of thought I would. In community in the loose sense of like awesome folks to chat about things with, and making some real friends in the process. And again, it wasn't really a depth year goal so much, but the Elements book being something that I had picked up in late 2019 and being on the book stack and learning about the prerequisites kind of led me to it. And so, yeah, one of the places that for 2020, my depth year goal has indirectly led me to some depth kinds of explorations was through the reclaiming tradition and getting into reading Spiral Dance. And I'm finished Spiral Dance now, and I have so many thoughts. And maybe that's, something for a video on its own as well. Maybe a book review of Spiral Dance and my thoughts on feminist spirituality are two different videos, actually. They're definitely two different videos. So that'll be something that I'm looking at in the new year. So, areas of depth here 2020 that I have gone deep, that I feel like I've learned something important, that I feel like have shifted my path and shifted my life in one way or another, had to do with rediscovering the joy of books, discovering that Lenormand might not be 100% for me and that's okay. But I'm still interested in exploring it a little bit, just not so depth as I had initially started. And finally, looking into reclaiming tradition witchcraft in a deeper way, really, than I've ever looked at any kind of tradition as an adult, because of my, I would say, aversion to that kind of organized kind of spiritual religious community based on my upbringing. So that has been a really interesting exploration, not just of reclaiming, but of my feelings about religious or spiritual organization, and where I might fit in terms of a tradition, and whether exploring traditions has something, for me to really learn from and grow with. So that's been great. So this has been a longer rant. It's not a rant at all, ramble. It's been a longer ramble than I planned, but, when you're talking about deep things, that can tend to happen. So if you stuck with me, thank you so much for watching. I will be back probably after I'm done the term papers for a little bit more of a recap of the depth year 2020 in terms of the reading that I've done and the decks that I've worked with in particular. And of course, coming up, I will be thinking about and talking about whether I have any kind of depth year plans or goals or resolutions for 2021, which I'm already thinking about as I organize, my planner and all of those good things that come with the turn of the year. So thank you so much. Have a good one. Talk to you all soon.